Thanks for joining us. My name is Steve Culman. I'm the State Specialist in Soil Fertility here at OSU. And this talk is going to be a little tag team between myself and Will Osterholz, who formerly, in a former life, was a postdoc researcher in my lab. And then we were fortunate enough to have Will go on with ARS in Columbus, so he's still around and able to contribute. Appreciate Doug outlining and laying out kind of how we think about soil balancing, this idea of it's complicated, right? This world is a complicated place, and how all of the various ways that farming is practiced is also complicated. There's a lot of different variety out there. So we've got to pin our hats to something, and we have to say, you know, in the context of this project, we're thinking about, we recognize that people do a lot of different things. Some, you know, have different practices they might emphasize, but really one of the core thing that we're talking about here today is this idea of, are we managing calcium? Are we thinking about calcium-mag ratios? Okay, so the classic, you know, well, let me ask this: how many folks have ever taken like an agronomy or soil fertility class in high school or in grad school? How many folks did you even learn about soil balancing? So I did not when I was going through school. And if you're lucky, you'll get a textbook that might have about a page or two on it, right? And this is the framework. The framework is, there's three basic philosophies out there. There's this build and maintain approach for soil fertility. There's this efficiency level approach. And then there's this third little animal, the BCSR, base cation saturation ratio. So that's like a lot of words, and maybe it means absolutely nothing to you, but we just call it soil balancing for short, right? So, and as Doug just laid out, you know, we think about how calcium, magnesium, and potassium, the amount, when we're talking about saturation ratios, just to make sure everybody's on the same page here, we're talking about the amount of each one of those cations occupying on exchange sites, right? So of the total exchange sites, the big sponge of soil, right? We're managing in BCSR, soil balancing, we're managing for calcium to be somewhere between 60 and 75%. All right. So there is a rich history. BCSR soil balancing has not been around for, has been around for quite a long time. It started really in the 1800s. Some work happened in New Jersey, but really it's at the University of Missouri with William Albrecht that is often given, you know, the credit for this. And so Albrecht was at, you know, a very accomplished career as a soil scientist, was the chair of the soils program at the University of Missouri, did a lot of work there, had a long career, and in 1975 he published these papers, right? This kind of litany or manifesto of sorts of how he thought about soils and how we thought about plants and people, right? So really kind of visionary in thinking of the health of soil affecting the health of plants and then the health of people or ruminants that we're feeding on those forages, right? So a lot of these kind of ideas that might be a little bit more commonplace today, I'm not saying started with Albrecht, but certainly he was a proponent of that. There's been, you know, this is not a comprehensive slide in any regards, but Charles Walters at Acres USA in the 70s really helped popularize this. If you go back and read Albrecht, how many folks have ever seen these or read any of these books? Can I just see a show of hands? Okay, so a few, that's great. Albrecht talks about actual base saturation. He talks about percentages of calcium on those exchange sites. It's really Charles Walters that kind of did the math for us and did the shortcut of ratios. So this idea of what's our ratio of calcium to magnesium. Okay, we use those today as one and the same, but maybe that's an important distinction. Okay, so if you care about these sorts of things, about 10 years ago, a review paper was published in a soil science journal, And these authors concluded that, well, we can read it, of course. Can you read that in the back, Sam? It's probably kind of small, right? It says, Albrecht concluded that it's important to maintain a high calcium saturation percentage. Indeed, it was his observation that would eventually form the basis of this idea, the whole concept of soil balancing. It would seem, however, that the design interpretation was flawed because of the fact that Albrecht did not often control for pH when he did his experiments, right? So we're adding lime, we're getting a pH bump. What's happening? Is that an effect of calcium or is it an effect of the soil pH, right? So this is like, if you talk to soil scientists, they'll say this is the main problem, right? This is why Albrecht's work, even though he was a good scientist, this idea of confusing those two, right? So what's wrong with soil balancing, or why calcium's a good thing? We apply lime routinely. What about a little bit more, right? Is calcium going to have some kind of negative effect? From a university perspective, the answer to that is really probably not, right? We don't run into issues of calcium toxicity, but what we are interested and very concerned about is costs of production and return on investment. So this idea of economic implications, this is just kind of a graph, right? Just to contrast two major philosophies. One, the tri-states, that is really based on this idea of SLAN, sufficiency level. Calcium, magnesium, potassium. Tri-states, if you read the document, says calcium extractable levels should be 200 ppm or more. If you're less than 200 ppm, you're going to run into calcium deficiency. How many folks have ever seen a soil test that have calcium less than 200 part per million? I mean, it just, in Ohio, I mean, they do exist, but for Ohio soils, that would be a very rare thing. Magnesium at 50%. And then, of course, for potash, we have a stair-step approach based on CEC. This band right here, okay, so this is our extractable calcium. This axis is our CEC, right? So low CEC soils, those sandy soils versus heavier clay soils moving down this way. So the idea is, if you're soil balancing and subscribing to this approach, depending on what your CEC is going to have dramatic implications in terms of what you're quote-unquote required or recommended to get your soils to these levels, right? So these bands right here, these ribbons, are between that 60 and 75% for calcium, 10 to 20 for mag. So if you're farming ground that's 20 CEC or higher, if it's heavier ground, we're going to, your CECs are probably, or your calcium percentages are probably going to be somewhere in here. But you might, if you're following this Albrecht approach, you might have to add quite a bit more to get it to that level. So this is a concern. And, it's not a great concern for me because I'm not paying the bills, but we have to be thinking about this from kind of a farmer perspective, right? Some of this work we went out, and I just want to give you this, just a little bit of an idea in terms of what kind of the state of fertility folks that are out there. We asked the question, can you even see the slide? I'm having a hard time seeing it. Yeah. So anyways, we'll post these slides if people want to see them. But we went out and we polled the like 100 soil fertility folks across land grants like myself, and we asked them these questions. Okay, so this is just a little bit of a snippet of information, but it's kind of revealing. We asked the question, there's no scientific merit to this approach, and it's been repeatedly shown, okay? Basically, everybody said either neutral or strongly agree, or, agree or strongly agree. Nobody said disagree with that. Then we asked the question, I have not seen enough evidence to either credit or endorse, discredit or endorse this approach. Well, you can see from the numbers that there's quite a bit of range. There's a lot more kind of ambiguity here. And then again, drilling down to maybe a similar type question, it's possible that farmers do see benefits from this approach. 2%, that's probably one observation that said they strongly agree, but there's a mix in terms of how people are viewing this. Okay, so this is just kind of from the scientific community. but it's illuminating in the context that there's a perception from the quote-unquote experts that soil balancing is something that's been done and figured out, and like we're beyond that. We're moving on. And even when we sent the survey out, the attitude, I got emails because they knew it came from us, and I got emails going, Steve, what in the hell are you guys doing this for? Like, why don't you go back and figure out how to create a wheel? We've already figured this out. We've moved past this, right? So there's like this perception that does exist, but we, as a team, have tried to keep a very open mind and engage with people, and I think that really is a good attribute to the work that we have done. Okay, so Doug showed this. We went back and we wanted to look at what has actually been done. What's science, right? Our gold standard is peer-reviewed publications. That's what science talk about. Can it get vetted? We went back and looked. 15 peer-reviewed studies that have been published on calcium-magnesium saturation ratio. 7 of those were in the field with actual field experiments, and 8 in the greenhouse. Ladies and gentlemen, does this represent what you would consider a large body of work? No. So we've got 100 years we've been thinking about this, and we've got 7 field studies that have been published, right? And we actually went, and when we asked researchers, because there's this thing called publishing bias that happens, right? Which means that you can run experiments and you don't see a damn thing, and then you're like, well, this is boring, I'm not writing it up, or it's hard to get published. So we even asked about that. But even in the last, like, say, 20 or 30 years, there's been very little work done here. So again, just to frame this, we've got this conundrum where there's a lot of growers practicing it, and really, from my perspective, land-grant universities have just la 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 la, we're not going to think about this or deal with it, right? And some of that is funding driven, right? I mean, we are kind of kind of. Well, we do think about writing grants from time to time, yeah. Okay. Any other comments about okay. Okay, well, I appreciate your, that's great. Okay, so this slide, there's no evidence to suggest, we don't have evidence. Does that mean it doesn't work? So it's like this, it means that we just don't have evidence to show that it works, right? So this is the place that we're in. This is 2018, this is really the state of things with calcium, magnesium ratios in soil science. Okay. So, why this disconnect? Is it possible that managing calcium-magnesium ratios, quote-unquote, work or are effective, but it might have been rooted originally in science that wasn't stellar, right? So this is a real possibility that we can think about. Okay, so we know that there's a general relationship between calcium and organic matter. And so here we're going to kind of just explore some ideas of why this practice, may be good or might be beneficial, or we're just kind of doing some exploring here. Increasing calcium-magnesium ratios in practice. When we talk to farmers, we talk to crop consultants. This should be no surprise to most folks in this room. But calcium-magnesium, how do we increase calcium saturation? We do 2 things. We either add lime or we add gypsum. Thank you. Gypsum. So lime, and often not just any lime, not dolomite, but typically we specify this with a high calcium lime, very low magnesium lime, to actually try to bump those saturations. High cal lime, what does it do? It adds 2 things. We just talked about this. Calcium, and increases the pH, right? If your pHs are already optimal and you don't want to increase the pH, you typically are going to go with gypsum, another economical amendment. Gypsum does not increase pH, despite some misconception about that. The effects on crops are inconsistent at best. Sometimes we see positive benefits, sometimes we don't. We'll hear more about that later on today. Gypsum, we know, that gypsum is routinely used to remediate soil, right? So places like in the West or in the Dakotas, when we have salt, dry conditions, we don't have this in Ohio. We get plenty of precip to wash that sodium out. But if we go to the West, it's very common to use gypsum to remediate soils. And what that means, you've got high salt soil, specifically sodium. We can use that gypsum, that calcium sulfate, right? It's calcium and sulfate. We can use that to flush out the sodium off that exchange site. So if we think about base cations, calcium, magnesium, potassium, and then sodium is a lesser one. It's important, it occupies things, but in Ohio that's typically not an issue because of the water. So we know gypsum can help remediate soil and improve physical structure. But here's the rub here. Should farmers use it? When we apply gypsum, we're applying calcium and sulfur. And there's a lot of interest in using gypsum as a sulfur source, of course. For grain crop production, when we're applying gypsum for the sulfur, we're talking about 10, 20, 50 pounds. Does that sound about right? But when we're talking about it from actually moving that needle and increasing calcium saturation, we're talking about tonnage, right? So it's a whole different scale going from managing for sulfur nutrition and just applying a little bit of gypsum to get some sulfur versus actually trying. You think about what soil is and how heavy it is and how much of it there is below our feet, right? Even though some of it might be leaving at faster rates than we like, but actually taking and applying to flush out that mag and that potassium, that sodium, and replace it with calcium, that's we're talking about applying tons. And so this is the issue, right? Is it economical? Are we going to get a return on investment for applying tons of gypsum? Okay, so going back to this idea, when we add lime, two ththings happen. Always. We are adding calcium and we're raising the pH, right? So is it possible that when we've applied, how many folks, lime is an important amendment in Ohio? If you agree with this question, please raise your hand. Lime is an important amendment in Ohio and we need to apply lime for good crop production, typically. Hey, we've got consensus. Okay, what if I ask the question, calcium sulfate, gypsum is an important amendment in Ohio and we need to add gypsum for good crop production. How many people would agree with that? Okay, so we've got a few, maybe half of the room, but certainly not universal, right? So is it possible that when we add lime, we're seeing benefits besides raising pH? The answer should be, at this point, of course it's possible, right? It brings us to one of my favorite scientific philosophies of correlation versus causation. Okay, so let's you've probably got your favorite spurious relationships, but let's walk through a few of my favorite. We've got an Internet Explorer rate versus the murder rate, and we can see a pretty good correlation over the last. If my pointer will cooperate with me. I think I've got another one here. Oh, okay. Okay, great. All right. I can point, right? I've got long arms. As our Internet Explorer rate drops, our murder rate in the U.S. has dropped as well. We've got U.S. fatality rate versus fresh lemons imported from Mexico. So we're going to be offering fresh squeezed lemonade at the break here. And then my personal favorite, number of people have drowned by falling into a pool versus films Nicolas Cage has appeared in. Very good relationship here. And I ask the question again, when will this man stop making movies? The point, of course, is that we need to, think about these things. And we can't add lime without doing both. So is there ways that we can tease these relationships apart? And that's really what we've been trying to do the last 5-6 years here. Okay, so here's our working hypothesis. Adding lime increases nutrient availability, increases soil biological activity. We know that biology is strongly influenced by pH, and one of the most important things you can do as a grower, if you're trying to get your microbes all juiced up and revving, it's not adding bugs in a jug, but it's actually fixing your pH and getting it at an optimal level. So adding gypsum to the soil increases soil aggregation and physical structure, increases root growth, water and gas exchange, and increases biological activity. These indirectly improve crop growth. Okay, so this is the established, right? This is the established science, and this is kind of what we're working on. Somebody tell me why gypsum increases aggregation and physical structure. What does it do?
Causes things to clump together.
Causes things to clump together. Okay. That's the word. Lowers the mag. And what does mag do?
Holds things together.
Holds things together. So this idea, we hear this time and time again. And I'll ask for a show of hands how many people have seen this on their farm. You add gypsum, you flush that mag off, it takes those tight soils, it loosens it up, right? And that essentially helps with aeration, helps with maybe infiltration of water, gas exchange, and then it's that simple. What's wrong with us that we can't, soil scientists can't get this together and just kind of sort this out so, we've satisfied it for ourselves. Okay, so aggregation, of course, is a key function, a key property of soil physical structure. We've got the biology, the chemistry, and the physical piece. Aggregation works in mysterious ways, really. It's roots and microbes and all the biological goo that occurs. Little bits form bigger bits. Microaggregates form macroaggregates. And when we get macroaggregates, we have big pores, these macropores that are really functionally important for water movement and for gas exchange. And that's what's driving that below-ground ecosystem, okay? So again, going back to that idea of calcium loosens soil up, magnesium tightens it. We've got calcium. A little fun fact for you. We talk about calcium and magnesium with their hydration radius, right? So calcium occupies a smaller space on an atomic level than magnesium does, and because that, it can actually form bits together. So it's this idea, we call it flocculation. So it's clays actually holding together, forming these microaggregates, moving up, assembling into these macroaggregates. So it's all about aggregation. With magnesium, the concept is that it's going to be pushing them apart, and it's the idea of, think of a slurry, right? We take soil, we slurry it, and then we've totally destroyed the structure. It dries out, and is air and water able to move through that matrix. This works with sodium, right? We're positive about this relationship with sodium. But when it comes to the nuanced difference between calcium and magnesium, that's where the state of soil science is there's a little bit more iffiness to it. Work from Indiana in 2002 showed that when we take soils in the lab and we flood them with calcium, or we flood them with calcium or flood them with magnesium, we can get differences in infiltration rate. In other words, water's moving through this calcium amended soil faster than it's moving through this magnesium amended soil. Okay, so this is nice evidence. But when you kind of look and read between the lines, first of all, not all soil types are responsive. And if you look at how they did it, all these soils that were responsive were amended to the fact that they had 80, 90, 95% magnesium saturation, okay? How many folks have ever seen a soil test coming from Ohio with 80% mag saturation? Doesn't happen, right? So the concept's here, but it's not really real world, right? Lab conditions with really high mag, okay? So anyways, I want to talk now, and I'm going to pass the torch to Will to tell us about some of the work that we've been done. So I'll stop talking and actually show you some, and Will show you some data now, so appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So we've heard from Steve and Doug that there's really very little hard data out there about soil balancing. So a big part of this project, this organic research project, was actually implementing some field trials. So there's sort of two components to this. There were a number of these on-farm trials, which are the black stars on this map, and then we also had two research station trials, which were performed at OSU facilities, and that's what I'm going to cover today. I believe that Luceline will be talking about the on-farm trials later on today, so if you stick around, you can hear about those as well. So just a little background on these two locations that we performed this experiment. One was near Worcester, so where the OARDC is. The soil out there is a silt loam soil, relatively low cation exchange capacity. Our initial pH was around 6, so a little bit on the low side, and our initial calcium-magnesium ratio was also a little bit on the low side from what soil balancers might recommend. Our second site was at a farm called the Herzl Farm, and that's on a Hoytville clay, or a Hoytville clay loam, so that's typical of soils of this part of Ohio. High cation exchange capacity. The initial pH on this site was pretty high. It was above 6.5. And our initial calcium-magnesium ratio was also quite high at this site. So we started this experiment in 2015. So we've been through 4 growing seasons up to this point, and we have one more in the works for next year. But I'm just going to share data up until last year. Each of these sites, we have a 3-year crop rotation, corn, soybeans, small grain. And I do want to point out that both of these sites are organically managed. So this means that there's compost supplied for fertility. Also, the tillage regime is going to be representative of an organic system, so relatively high disturbance. And then our treatments that we applied included gypsum, high-cal lime, so these are the 2 big ones we hear about in soil balancing. And then we also included a few other amendments in an effort to try to develop some big differences between the different treatments. So we applied dolomitic lime to some of our plots, and dolomitic lime is just a higher magnesium liming material. We also applied Epsom. Epsom is magnesium sulfate, so that's really just a direct source of magnesium. And then sulfur was our last amendment, and we included sulfur in these experiments because, as we know, sulfur lowers the pH of the soil. So we were trying to find a way to separate out the effects of calcium versus pH that happen when we lime a soil. So this sort of conundrum that Steve was talking about earlier. So we included sulfur for some of our treatments. And then in terms of the measurements we took, we tried to take a really wide view of this experiment and measure a whole bunch of different things. So we looked at weeds. I'm not going to talk about that data today, but we also took a lot of crop data. So we were trying to understand nutrient availability to the crop, and then also, of course, yield measurements. And in terms of the soil measurements, we looked at both your standard nutrient, your standard soil test information. We also did some soil health testing. So we looked at 3 different sort of soil health indicators, sort of biological indicators. And then we also wanted to look at the effects on physical structures. So aggregate stability is still in the works, so I'm not going to be able to show that data today, but I will show some information on penetration resistance and infiltration that we took on these plots. Okay, so data. Here we go. This first slide is I'm not sure if you'll all be able to see this, but I'll try to explain the main points here. So we're looking at the calcium to magnesium ratio. So if you have a high calcium to magnesium ratio, that means you have more calcium relative to the magnesium in that soil. And these graphs here are showing the change in this ratio over time, over the course of this experiment. So at Worcester, we can see we started, around this 4.5 point, and then as we applied these amendments over time, you can see this nice separation in the treatment. So our amendments were able to change the calcium-magnesium ratio. Specifically, we saw that applying gypsum plus lime gave us our highest calcium-magnesium ratio. So, adding a lot of calcium into this soil at the Worcester site really did have a strong influence on our calcium saturation. And then on the flip side, we can see that we were able to lower this ratio where in the treatments that we applied Epsom, so this magnesium-containing amendment. Okay, so this is just a nice sort of proof of concept that the treatments we were applying were having the intended effect, at least at the Worcester site. Now at our Herzl site, again, this is on that Hoytville soil. The effects on calcium-magnesium ratio are much less clear. We did see some influence of this treatment here is the Epsom treatment. So when we applied Epsom to this soil, we were able to lower the calcium-magnesium ratio somewhat. But I want to point out the scale here. So our scale is running from 2 to 9. And at Herzl, our calcium-magnesium ratio, even in the Epsom treatment, was still above 6. So we were able to impact the calcium-magnesium ratio at this Herzl site, but it was much less responsive than our Worcester site. Yeah, go ahead.
Is that because of some of the buffering in the soil?
That's our thinking, is that, this higher clay content, high cation exchange capacity, these soils just aren't as responsive over the same time frame as compared to this Worcester soil, which had a lower cation exchange capacity. Yeah.
And does also the natural higher lime content of the Hoytville versus the Canfield Worcesters also play a dance?
Yeah, and we saw that, when we the initial pH was much higher at this Herzl site. So yeah, that plays into it as well. Yeah, I'll take another question back there too.
Just looking at your chart, so you're right that the total application,
Yeah.
6,500 pounds of product on that 1 acre.
Yeah, and I do want to point out that this is over the whole course. So each year we would apply a new increment of that amendment. So this is over 4 years we applied a total of 6,500 pounds an acre. So we were applying significant amounts of material, and that was because we were really trying to drive apart these treatments as much as we could. Okay, so I'm going to move on, and I just want to show the soil pH results here quickly. At Worcester, things, the results were just like we expected, where we applied liming agents, either the high cal lime or the dolomitic lime. We increased our pH up to almost 7. So that was a really nice result. At the Herzl site, we also saw this effect, but again, less responsive than the Worcester site. And again, I think that goes back to, just the inherent characteristics of that soil. One of our treatments here at the Herzl site, this green bar here is a gypsum plus a sulfur treatment, and for some reason we saw that the pH didn't change in that treatment. So I'm not sure what's driving that, but that particular treatment was a little bit unexpected, the response we saw.
Elemental sulfur.
Yeah, elemental sulfur. So we would expect that to drive down pH, and we just didn't see that for that particular treatment. And so a quick sort of summary before we get into a few more of these results. So the responses we were really interested in were, not the pH and the calcium-magnesium ratio. We expected to be able to see that. What we were really interested in were these other responses, things like the soil health responses, the crop responses, things that haven't been shown yet in the literature. We wanted to see if we could see any evidence of that from this experiment. So just as a quick sort of, maybe disappointing to some of you in the room, but over the first 4 years of this experiment, we haven't been able to show any significant effects of these treatments on our soil health indicators. So no difference, no separation. So again, this was an organic system, so we have high tillage. Every year there's, significant soil disturbance. So that is a caveat to some of these data. Yeah, go ahead.
With the high tillage, do you feel like you were diluting what you're putting on? Because if you got 1,000 tons of soil in the top 8 inches and you're putting on only 2,000 or 3,000 pounds, that's pretty dilute solution if you stir it constantly.
Yeah, it's a fair point. Yeah. Again, we tried to put on a lot, and we were trying to really replicate what a really aggressive soil balancing strategy might be. And based on those sorts of rates, we weren't able to see any differences. But maybe if we applied more, we would see differences. That's a fair point. In terms of the crop responses, in terms of nutrient availability of these crops, it was mostly sulfur and calcium that we saw impacts of these treatments. So I'll show a little bit more of that data moving forward. We didn't see any differences in soil test availability other than the calcium and sulfur. So when we added calcium and sulfur, we changed the soil test values, but that didn't have any sort of knock-on effects to our other soil nutrient tests. And then grain yield response, I'll show a little bit of this data as well, but it's been rare and not consistent among treatments and sites. Okay, so I'll show a little bit of information here. These are the tissue and calcium and magnesium concentrations, and West Badger is the name of our Worcester farm, so that's the Worcester site. And this is just showing that we did see some significant differences amongst these treatments. Specifically at the West Badger site here, where we added calcium, the treatments we added calcium, we saw higher calcium concentration in the tissue. In the treatments where we added magnesium, we saw higher magnesium concentration in the tissue. Makes sense. So pretty straightforward responses there. I do want to point out these red dashed lines are the sufficiency levels that you'll see in the tri-state recommendations. So we're well above these sufficiency levels for all of our treatments. So even though we were able to show some slight variation based on these treatments, none of them even came close to pushing the level that we would consider deficient for either calcium or magnesium. And at the Herzl site, again, less response overall. We were able to see a little bit, very slight differences in tissue calcium, but nothing major there at the Herzl site. Okay. So NPK, the macronutrients, no differences in tissue concentration. So these soil balancing amendments, we didn't have any influence at all on NPK. We were able to see differences in tissue sulfur. So in the treatments that contained either gypsum or, some of these treatments gypsum was the main one here. So where we applied gypsum, we were able to see higher tissue sulfur and when we took these samples. But again, we're well above the sufficiency level where we would expect to see some sort of yield response to increased sulfur in the tissue. And the final sort of crop nutrient response here is looking at a couple of these micronutrients, so zinc and boron, zinc on the top, boron on the bottom. So we were able to see some differences at the Worcester site, but it seems like these differences are mostly driven by pH and not related to the calcium-magnesium ratio. So it's well established that pH can influence zinc and boron availability in the soil. So we were able to see that here, but maybe not much evidence for a soil balancing effect per se. It's more of a liming effect here. Okay, now yields. So again, like I mentioned earlier, not much in the way of a yield response here, and this has been pretty much what we've seen. Every year we've tried this experiment, so the last 4 years. No effect on corn yield, no effect on soybean yield. I didn't put the small grain yields on here, but it's the same story. We haven't been able to see anything in terms of the yield we've gotten from these treatments. Okay, and then I want to spend a little bit of time here on the physical properties, because again, this is one of the the main points that soil balancing proponents will make is that, this is increasing aggregation, increasing water movement through the soils. So our first measurement here is soil penetration resistance. So a lot of you are probably familiar with this measurement. It's just using the hand probe. You push into the soil and measure how much resistance you get. So here we have two sets of measurements. One was done in July and one was done in October, okay? So our July measurements are on the left here, and we didn't see any significant treatment effects in our July measurement. Our penetration resistance was pretty high in July, and that's mainly a response to the weather conditions out there. It was dry, hot, the soils get hard, so you get more penetration resistance. However, in our October measurement, we were actually able to see some treatment effects at the Worcester site. Specifically, is actually the Epsom and the dolomite was one of the highest treatments, and so this is sort of what we would expect, right? If we apply a lot of magnesium to this soil, so that's Epsom contains magnesium, dolomite contains magnesium, we're really amping up the magnesium content of that soil, and that increased the penetration resistance. So maybe a little bit of evidence here that altering these ratios can have some impact on the physical properties of the soil.
Are you only going 4 inches deep?
I'm just showing the top 4. We did go to 8 inches. Yep. When we went deeper, the response became less apparent. It was the largest difference was in that very top 4 inches. Yeah.
Just for chuckles, did you do it after a couple of days after a rainstorm when it was more field capacity, and that would work more dominantly?
Yeah, well, actually, the October in our October in Worcester was quite wet, so we wouldn't have been able to find a time period that wasn't a couple days after a rainfall, I think. So yes, these and you can see that in the scale here on the axis. It's much smaller, and that's because the soil was moist, and it's a lot easier, to push that probe into a moist soil. Okay, and then this is my last data slide, so thanks for sticking with me. But maybe one of the most interesting here, we did take some water infiltration measurements at these sites, and this is a challenging measurement to take because, as I'm sure you're all aware, infiltration across the field is highly variable, and so trying to take enough measurements to get a good idea of what's actually happening on a larger scale is a challenge. The other challenge here, especially at our Herzl site, is it takes a long time to infiltrate water on these heavier soils. So again, that Hoytville soil, you're out there for a couple hours and you've only infiltrated a few inches. It's not the most exciting work, and it takes a lot of time. So, but we did our best. And here again, we have a July and an October measurement. So our July measurement, we weren't able to see any big differences in infiltration. But in our October measurement, again, the error bars on these measurements are really high, so that just means there's a lot of variation between the measurements. But it seems that the treatments where we had applied gypsum on this Hoytville soil, we actually had higher infiltration. So this blue bar and the green bar are both treatments with gypsum applied. And so again, not statistically significant at this point, but we're hoping to repeat these measurements and maybe drill down and actually be able to show that definitively. So just a suggestion here, again, maybe we are having some impact on these physical parameters and water being able to move into these soils. So,
quick question.
Yeah.
On that last slide.
Right.
If you are seeing a difference, is the difference between a measurement of 0.06 and 0.1 can amount to a hill beans?
Yeah, it's a fair point. What does this mean? So this is inches per hour is the unit there. So if you think about, again, these are pretty low values, and that's partially a function of the way we do the measurement. But, this is 0.06 up to 0.1. That's, what is that, 80% increase, if you think of it in a percentage term. So yeah, I think it could be, it could be significant.
But if you look at it at the old way we looked at infiltration, it's still within one infiltration unit range of 0.06 to 0.6 would have been the typical break back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Okay.
That's before his time.
Yeah, you're. I got to pick your brain a little bit more and see how things used to be done. Yeah. Okay, so I think Steve maybe was going to just speak a little bit about the rest of the activities happening in this.
Sure. We're wrapping up here, folks. Just a couple other points here, and we're not going to spend much time on it. We've got a paper that's, this is conventional continuous corn that Warren Dick started, and we've got this, across the finish line. It's in press right now, but 2 sites in Ohio on our OSU research farms, and the same ones that we actually described, not the exact same farms, but same locations in Worcester and in Hoytville. 4 years of continuous corn, 3 application rates of gypsum and 3 timings, once a year, once every other year. And again, somewhat limited response. We did have 1 year where we did see a hit. It was the third to last year for gypsum application, again at Hoytville, at those heavier clay soils. And then I'm not even going to talk about this because Lucilene's going to mention, she's going to talk about this after our break. Let's just kind of wrap things up. One of the things that we're interested, we might not have these quote unquote significant differences, but just trying to give farmers a sense of what's it actually going to take and what's it going to cost. If you're at, say, 55% base saturation of calcium and your soil is 18 CEC, like how much calcium is it going to take to get you to that 60 or 70%, right? We've run 60 field trials over the last 4 years where we've applied a ton of gypsum and gone back and measured in the fall to see how much it moved that needle. This is really disappointing because actually each one of these data points is the average of 4 replicates. And you can just see that we were trying to relate this is a change in calcium-magnesium ratio as a percentage versus CEC. There's a general relationship there. The heavier your soils get, the more calcium you're going to need to add. But, I don't think we're going to have a really nice way to predict that. You're just going to have to go out and pull a soil test in a couple years to see if you're managing for calcium-magnesium. So, so our conclusions really, we don't have much evidence right now. So that doesn't mean that we've refuted this idea. The work that we do has limitations, right? So the first one is that it's a different system than a lot of people are used to working with, their organic system. How many folks here are certified or farm any certified, have anything to do with certified ground? Okay, so not many. So we're interested as a team, and we recognize that we need to think about this outside of organic systems, right? If you saw the yields, pretty low yields, but how does that relate to a conventional framework? And again, as I've been reminded, it's funding driven, right? So we need to think we're trying to work to do this work on a conventional frame. And then,
one of the things, and this is speaking from my former life, I was a dairy farmer, was an organic dairy farmer. Thank God my boys didn't want to milk cows, so I got out of that racket. What I want to tell you is in the mid-2000s, when I was transitioning to organic, I went to a lot of organic dairy producing conferences. Okay? The organic people touted William Albrecht. That's the first time I ever heard about it. Okay? William Albrecht this, William Albrecht that. And if you look at his information, he's talking about plant health, soil health. The healthier the plant, the better my livestock's going to be, so that you get this whole holistic viewpoint that the organic, especially dairy producers, look at. you talk to any dairy nutritionist, they're going to talk about calcium potassium ratios in their forage. So I think that's where a lot of this calcium balancing, calcium ratios are looking at. These guys that have the base saturations in the right range, at least from what I've seen, have very good forage quality, and probably do something, hopefully solve something of that nature. So I just want you guys that are used to conventional wisdom understanding where that thought process is coming from on a lot of the organic people. They're not looking at necessarily, I got 10 more bushels of corn. Most of them, because I think primarily a lot of them either sell their crops to organic dairymen or they're organic dairy producers themselves. They have the mindset, how many pounds per acre of milk am I getting? And it's a different measurement of yield than what conventional crop advisors think about.
I'm curious, Doug and Caroline, were you able to? Do you remember? Were you able to pull apart any of this from the surveys, like a greater propensity for soil balancing if you're dairy versus a grain farmer? Yes. Okay. So that would.
For dairy farmers and vegetable farmers.
And I'm just telling you that's the thought process that's involved in that.
Yeah. So it's a good point. A couple other things I want to make. So you can see the conclusions, right? Well, I guess that's it. This business of moving to a conventional framework, this work needs to get done. I don't know how we're going to do it, but we need to do it. The other thing is we have the luxury at OSU on these research farms to go out and apply a bunch of magnesium and try to see things tighten up. But that's obviously not something that we can do kind of on farm, right? So that's a piece that we've been kind of struggling with. And then finally, this business of our no differences. We know, and we've been told at least, that these sorts of changes take time. Changing soil physical properties do take time, so we want to be patient about this. And when we're thinking about water, Will alluded to this, but when we're thinking about water dynamics, our plots are 8 rows of corn, 20 feet by 40, 50 feet, right? So when we get a big rainstorm, is water going to be moving from one plot to another? I mean, it's level ground, but our scale might be small, like admittedly just a little bit too small for some of these these differences that we can measure infiltration at a small level, but when it comes to kind of whole plot process and yield, we might be missing some of the mark. But this is just trying to acknowledge some of the limitations, so the knowledge that we're trying to present here today. Yes, sir.
You did your test stuff. Did you talk to a soil balancer consultant and kind of get his take on what you do? And vice versa?
Great comment about did we talk to balances. We had a advisory committee team. Honestly, I think one of the strengths of the team is that we didn't know much about this going in. We knew some, enough to make us dangerous, but we worked with consultants in all of our the applications and the rates. The development of treatments were all done in tandem with that stakeholder advisory committee, which was made up of consultants and growers. Yep. So, other comments or questions? This is a big, broad topic. Yes, Curtis.
Why did you make it? Maybe I missed this earlier. Why did you pick organic ground to do all this on?
Because the funding source is through the USDA organic program. Yep. Curtis, I assume that's a good enough reason for you. Yeah. No. Yeah, and that's and again, we're hoping as a team to scale this up, and hopefully some of these results can help justify that, right? Other comments or questions?
Yeah, if you want to get funding, change your title to Improving Water Quality, and I'll bet you. Just a guess.
Calcium for and we've got some evidence of that, right? That gypsum with water quality. I mean, that's work that's been demonstrated in Ohio. Gypsum application, at least for the short term, reduces DRP levels. So DRP load. Yep.
The other point I want to make, especially in our area, up in the Holmes Lane area, there's an individual up there that is a big proponent of every farm that he works with, and he just recommends a blanket 500 pounds of gypsum an acre, no matter what. No matter where your base saturations are, no matter what your soil test is, no matter whether you're low on phosphorus or potassium or anything like that, you know, he just 500 pound blanket gypsum. And so, and he's been doing that for 20 plus years, and so you get that kind of a individual out there that's very well known in the area, does a lot of sales in the area, you know, has influence in that community up there, and so that's what you see a lot of going on in my opinion.
Yeah. Is there such a thing as too much chocolate cake, Doug?
I don't, you know, I look at it and I'm like, why? You know?
Yeah.
And now with the layered manure we got up there, I'm concerned that they're hitting 500 pounds of gypsum and then putting a ton of manure on that's got 80 pounds of calcium in it.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Well, with that, one last comment. Yes, sir.
I have a question on how many years those two farms in comparison to the
Question was, how long have these farms been organic? Since 2005 and 1996, so quite a bit of time. They weren't like recently transitioned, actively managed organically.